There we go. All right. So, overcoming racial discursive buffer. I need to close these faces off because they're going to distract me while I'm talking. How to talk about racism when no one else wants to, but applied to the TESOL world. That's my name. Okay, so here's the agenda. Who, right? A little bit of my bio, which some of which you heard, but I'll give you a little bit more. What is this, right? What does that even mean? Why does it matter? How can we do this? And what should we do in the future? Okay. First, this is a discussion, not a lecture. I know webinar could mean anything. It could be a lecture. It could be a lot of things, but I don't really like to lecture. I don't mean that I don't like to talk. I love to talk, but I like to talk to people rather than at people. So after the beginning, when I explain a couple of things, you're all going to be talking. There will be times when I tell you, let's talk. Probably it works better if you raise your hand so we're not all shouting over each other. You've all been on Zoom enough over the last 4 years to know that it becomes a mess if we're just shouting, but I'll tell you when that time comes. Okay, so me, I was born and raised here on unceded Muncie Lenape territory, as you would know better as New York City. I live in Queens now. I grew up in Brooklyn and Manhattan. I pretty much lived all over the city. After I finished college in 2007, I went to teach English in Daegu, South Korea. I was there for 2 years, and I didn't know what I was doing, like a lot of people who just go overseas when they're like 21. And I figured out that I liked connecting with the students, but I didn't know anything about pedagogy. So I decided I needed to go back to school. And I came home and ended up in an online program, which means I didn't even have to come home, but I didn't know that when I left. Oh, well. So I came here and I went into the MATESOL program, which is where I met Leslie, and graduated in 2012. At the same time, in the background, I was underestimating myself. I thought that if I was in a master's program, I couldn't handle a full-time job. This was an incorrect assumption of myself. I can do that. But I was working terrible contingent teaching jobs for a few years. And then after I graduated and I had that credential, I was like, this is not going to work. I made $19,000 in 2012, which you may understand as not enough money to live in New York City. So I got a job as the manager for an adult TESOL program. Also, I was in charge of computer classes for senior citizens because nonprofits are weird. I still work for a nonprofit. That's not really an insult, but they are weird though. And then when I left that job, because that was, I guess, 9 years in the language classroom, and I was doing various things in sort of leadership roles, but that job, while stable and actually having health insurance, I met my wife and she was like, buddy, this is not going to cut it. Not the language part, but the salary part. So I got a different job doing more sort of curriculum development as an individual contributor for the Research Foundation of CUNY, City University of New York. It sounds like I worked on a campus. I didn't. I actually worked in a city government building, or actually state government office. We were sort of developing curricula for the state government. I was not a state government employee. I was a CUNY employee. And because I was a CUNY employee, and I'm going out of order here, I got a discount on CUNY programs. So I applied to and was accepted into a EDD program in instructional leadership at Hunter. Then right around the time that I was finishing my degree, I wanted a job where my skills from the last several years in curriculum development would come into play. My skills as an actual instructor would come into play, although I don't teach all that often at my main job. And also where the research skills that I gained in my doctorate would come into play. So I got this job where they didn't require that, but it's a bonus and it's going very well. A CDFI is a community development financial institution, basically a nonprofit lender. They lend to small businesses and mostly to businesses run by people of color and women and that sort of thing. And I'm in charge of developing our professional development programs for the public mostly. It's a great job. I like it. Anyway, that's my history. Some things you may know about me or don't know about me and that I've written. Probably the two articles, if you know anything about what I've written that you know, are Combating the Altruistic Shield and ELT, which was in the Nice TESOL Journal in 2020. Technically, it was released in December of 2019, but it says 2020 on it, so we'll call it 2020. Then the other article I wrote, Worth the Risk, Decentering Whiteness in English Language Teaching. Yes, the Canadian spelling because it's a Canadian journal, which was published the last week of May in 2020. I wrote it in January, but it came out in a, let's just say, interesting time for racial discussions. And that's why people started paying attention to me, because then Leslie said, do you want to do a webinar about it? And then I got a publishing deal. And the publishing deal led to the book in 2022. I was going to say last year. not 2023 anymore, Justin, called Antisocial Language Teaching, English and the Pervasive Pathology of Whiteness. All of these books and stuff are all on my website, which I'll show you the link to later. There's other articles which you can find on my website, but I'm more interested in the books now. So the next book that's coming out, I was diagnosed with ADHD in 2021, although I've obviously always had it, and there is not a book really out there that's chronicling from our perspective the experience of being a neurodivergent student of color, especially since so few of us are diagnosed as children. So I interviewed a few of neurodivergent adults of color, and we're reflecting on our experiences, and that's going to come out later this year. It's supposed to come out next year, but knowing me, I wrote the manuscript 8 months early, so that's how things go. And then the next book I'm going to work on, because I did actually get 2 book contracts in the same week. I knew it would happen. I don't know why these things always happen to me, but they always happen at the same time. Would be 15 Shades of White. Yes, that's a pun. Racism in Language Education in Different Global Contexts. It's basically a follow-up to my first book, because I still think people have an assumption that racism is this sort of American South thing because we're so loud, but it's everywhere. And I wanted to chronicle how it impacts language education in 15 different places. Okay. So what are discursive buffers? They are semantic moves or strategically managed propositions to safely state certain views. That comes from Bonilla Silva. That's the book that it's from. All right, that's a direct quote. I forget what page it's on. And they're not always about race. I added racial to the title because I'm focusing on that, but you could do it with gender, you could do it with disability, all right? But the point is, as you see at the bottom here, these are things people say that halt honest conversations about racism without using the word race. So this would not be, for example, oh, you're playing the race card. Like, that's just racist. But avoiding the topic while trying to stop you from talking about the topic. Allow me to give you some example. Nope, the examples are on the next slide. Justin, you screwed up your own order. Anyway, why does this matter? And then I'll give you some examples. What is in the way of my screen? Oh, the closed captioning thing, right. Essentially, language does not truly exist in a manner detached from the bodies or brains that produce it and interpret it, as you all understand with racial linguistic ideologies. Accordingly, especially with colonial languages such as English and French and Portuguese and so on, there has never been a time when the teaching and learning of these languages was divorced from identity. I mean, that's never been that's been true of all languages, but the hierarchies and power and so forth have always been a part of this. The context changes things, and that could be the location, it could be the register, and so forth. But no matter where you live and work, racialization, which is the process of ascribing race to people, occurs, and you and your students and colleagues need to contend with the impact of this, or else we're just going to keep spinning in circles. And I saw one of you was in Florida. I can't help you with your governor, but we can still have these conversations. Okay, now, here are some examples. These are things that have actually been said to me. I've also been discriminated against for my accent. Or, the real issue is xenophobia. Or, our team is very diverse, okay? These things are not inherently problematic, but I think you can see as I'm talking in the context in which I'm bringing them up, how these could stop you from having a more honest conversation about, let's say, accent discrimination or racism or the hiring on a team. Okay, and I don't know why this picture is there. That's what the little design genius gave me, and I find those pictures funny. All right, so stop and think. I want you to think, all right? Then you can look at these examples again if you want to in a second. I'll put them back on the screen. But basically, when you hear something like that, right? And this is something that comes up when you or someone has tried to talk about race or racism, and they do this to stop you from doing so. What's a good way to respond? I don't really mean the words, but like, what are some practices, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest of this, that you can employ in order to bring the topic back to where it is or to stop them from stopping you? I'll go back to the examples, and this would be something you put in the chat. Okay, we will do the unmute and out loud conversations in a few minutes. Okay, so stop and think. You say, you know, it's really harmful to work on accent reduction, and someone says, you know, I've also been discriminated for my accent. You say racism is the problem. Someone says the real issue is xenophobia. You say it seems like there's not a lot of people of color on our team, and you say our team is very diverse, by which I mean it's half women, right? So what are some ways you can deal with this? And here are my suggestions, and then we will have more of a discussion, and then you can ask questions before we continue. Always a good idea to ask questions, okay? Someone says something like that, have a question ready for them about why they said that or what that means, okay? People, and I'm not trying to tell you to be a coward, but people don't necessarily like being confronted. And if we're talking about being effective in doing this and not just being incendiary, which let's be clear, I like being incendiary, but I am not teaching you to be like me. Asking questions often works. You can also express confusion. Sometimes you're being dishonest, and if you're not good at lying or you're not good at having a poker face, maybe don't try that. But express confusion as to why that person said what they said or what they even mean. And I give everybody at least one chance. Okay? Someone says something like that, and then I respond with one of these moves. And if they pause or change tacks, then they've got a chance to learn and grow or even just stop doing it. But if they do this several times, well, I'm not saying you need to throw them in the garbage, but you know what you need to know because frankly, ain't nobody got time for that, right? Especially if you're a person of color yourself. Okay, so the rest of this, we are going to practice. I'm going to pause and see if anyone has questions in a moment, but the rest of this, we're going to go through 5 scenarios similar to this, and then I'm going to ask you first, why what is being said might be problematic, and then what could you say in response to that to keep the conversation going? All right, so first, are there any questions about what I'm asking you to do? And if so, I'm gonna look in the chat in a second. And then second, we're gonna do 5 different scenarios and we're just gonna have 5 different discussions about it. All right, so let me look at the chat. Some of you are already doing what I told you to do. You are ahead of the game, Lynn. All right, I don't think this was confusing. I try not to be confusing when I do these things. All right, you're all ahead of the game. Just wait. You'll have chances to do that. Okay, so these are the 5 things that we're going to do one at a time. And as I tell you, when you read this, there's 2 things I want you to do. I want you to tell me why what's being said is problematic or potentially problematic, and then put some, scripts together for what you might say in response. And I want you to do this so that you can learn from each other. I'm going to give you some patented scripts after you do it, though. Because if I just told you, well, then that's just a list and that's not useful. Okay? Okay. Great. Number 1. When I lived in South Korea, I understood what it was like to be a minority for the first time. At this point, you can unmute yourself if you want to, but you can also type in the chat if you prefer that. It would be better, as I said, for you to raise your hand so you're not yelling. But so again, why this sort of thing might be problematic, and then what you might say in response.
Hello, Gerald. One question is, this prompt on the board is in response to something we've already said?
Yes, that's the idea.
Okay.
Like I or you have said something about teaching in another country, right? And then they want to point out like, oh, I understand. You see what I'm saying? All right, good. So some people are responding. I see. Great. None of you have done the first part, which is why this is problematic. So someone please do that also. Because there might be people who don't understand, folks. Like, I don't assume everybody understands everything. So if someone wants to there we go. So Jen wrote, if you're not looking at the chat, problematic because it's likely a false equivalency relating privileged white minority experience to being minoritized. Okay, good questions here. Did you choose? Are we to assume this the speaker is someone who has never been racialized as white? I mean, sorry, never been racialized as a person of color. I think that that's what we should be assuming, yes. Power dynamics are not the same. Right, okay. I see that you're all doing this very easily here. I do want you to keep in mind that you should be ready to do this when they actually do it, right? Because again, these are people who, the way I'm creating the scenario, are not doing this with intentional malice. That doesn't mean that it's not a problem, but like those are the type of people who often get kind of offended when you push back on them, right? Because they think they're already doing the right thing. Okay?
Mm.
I see a lot of good responses, so I'll read out a couple more. If you're not reading it, could you
So
give?
Gerald, can I mention?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, for me, when I hear that, everyone's typing, so I'm gonna be the outlier and just speak. I think like if I talked about some issue I had and that was a response, I would feel like there wasn't a redress or an address of what I said, and instead, as mentioned in the chat, kind of like an equivalency, which I would feel like was a silencing of my voice
Great point,
and my
right?
agency.
Exactly. Sorry, I don't know. I see your last name. What's your first name?
Oh, I can't change the name thing. I don't know why it's like a block on the name thing.
Okay, but
Um,
I'm
but
not
I'm
the
Derek.
host, so
Derek.
Derek. Okay,
Sorry,
all right.
Derek.
So Derek said, right, that's exactly because this happened to me a lot when I was in South Korea, especially while I was in South Korea. They didn't say when I lived in South Korea, when I was in South Korea. They just said, hey, Justin, I understand what it's like to be a minority now. And I didn't have the wherewithal or the skills to respond with what I wanted to. I just sort of stared at them. Uh, and I'm now looking back 15 years later, like, man, I wish I would have called them out for it. Okay, that's the first one. I see a lot of good responses in there, and this is being recorded. So if it's recorded, that means the chat's recorded too. Let's continue. Well, my students told me that they want to reduce their accents. I hope you like the environmental picture. So I'll set the scene again, right? This is you saying, I'm kind of uncomfortable with the way we focus on accent reduction. And then someone else says, well, my students told me they want to reduce their accents. So you all know what to do. It always takes a second when you're in these things. I'm sorry that there's dead air, but that's just how these things go online. What has made them feel that way? Good job, Christine. Students are susceptible to the same systemic problems and conditioning. Right. You all are just experts. It sounds to me like you all have perfectly responded to every similar scenario in your life, right? Or is it just easier to do in a webinar? The point I'm making though is I'm not making fun of you all, right? But because take this and like write it down and bring it with you because it's kind of hard to do this stuff in the moment, right? And there might be people here who aren't responding because they're not necessarily sure what to say. And yeah, all right. Okay, so
I
I'll read a
Justin,
go.
can I add something? Yeah, because I totally agree with that. I feel like, when I'm typing or when I'm thinking about it, I can come up with a perfect response, but in the moment it's so hard. And I think that one of the things you suggested is what I've been trying to lean on, which is if I can't think of the perfect response in the moment, is turning it back on them and being like, well, what do you mean by that? And having them have to explain themselves. And then you can almost see sometimes as they're explaining it that they're like, well, maybe this isn't such a great line of thinking. So for me in the moment, sometimes turning it back on the person instead of putting myself on the spot and like having to come up with the perfect answer in that moment tends to work for me.
That is one of the things I'm going to suggest to you later. So yes, you all know what I'm going to say. Because yeah, when you're in the moment, like it's easy enough for me to sit here in a webinar. Not only am I being like asked to give a webinar on this and therefore to speak from some position of expertise and experience, but also like I feel protected to some extent. And then also because this is my work, people don't tend to do this nonsense with me nearly as often as they used to because they know what I'm going to do. But I think a lot of you are probably not in that position. You may not be someone who's had a whole bunch of work published on race or racism, or especially if you are racialized as white, they may think that you're going to agree with them, which I think is one of the challenges, right? Okay, let's go to number 3. And it says Indian, it could be Dominican, it could be Mexican, it doesn't really matter. I'm just using one because I had to choose something. Okay, Indian English just isn't what I'm going to be tested on. So what's wrong to give them credit for using it, right? So I think you all, I don't have to do this every time, but I think you all can imagine that I was saying, you know, why are we criticizing our students for using Indian or Dominican or whatever English? All right, we'll pause, see what people say here.
Why? That's my first response is like, why? Why do you think that? Let's talk it out. Let's. I wanna understand you. So can you talk a little bit more about it? That's what I
Right.
would. That's what I. I'm not a person who is like, you know, to want to put that person in a position to feel uncomfortable. I want to be generative. So I want to hear your responses, and from what the person responds, how can we, look back on what that person said to find something to generate from. So you said A, like you believe that it's wrong to give them credit. What is credit? What does education mean? What are we trying to do in the classroom? Something like that.
Those are all good ideas, Derek. Are we about giving credit or are we about making language intelligible, right? Are we about, I would put it also, are we about making meaning? To me, that's language, right? It's making meaning. And if meaning has been made, then what's the problem? Now, you could say, as this person is saying, well, that's what the test is. Well, as someone else is saying, the test might be part of the issue. So what do we do about that? Well, that's a big, long question, right? How do we deal with the tests? But you can do the tests as something you collaborate on as an obstacle to overcome that is not reflective of their value as people, right? We can't pretend the tests don't exist, but that's always what I tend to say about the test stuff is that you all can work together to overcome that obstacle and understand that they in their languaging is still affirmed. The grammar of that sentence did not work, but I think you would understand that it shouldn't matter. That's a good question. So Helene says, could we begin these responses by seeding the point for validation purposes and keeping them from becoming defensive, but then extending their thinking beyond where they are rather than posing ourselves as in opposition to them? That's always one good tactic too, right? You can always start with, I see what you're saying, or a similar phrase, which is not quite the same thing as agreeing, right? It's just not dismissing it out of hand because that's what they're doing to you. So if you do something, as Derek said, generative or open-hearted or whatever, and I'm not saying be nice, which is very different, folks. I'm saying give them the benefit of the doubt at first is what I'm saying, even if in your head, like this person does not deserve benefit of the doubt, but give them the benefit of the doubt at first, and then move on to your response, the questions, etc. Because the whole point is if you want to have a fight with somebody, go ahead, right? You don't need my help with that. But especially if this is a colleague, right? Which is most of these situations for me, you're going to have to work with them, right? So why make your life more difficult every day? You don't want to go to work and have to avoid a colleague for like years. Okay, the next one. they're going to need to use English like a native speaker to get any sort of job or get into school or whatever, right? So the prompt for this would be like, why are we judging them against native speakers, right? Isn't that just native speakerism? And then someone says, well, they're going to need to use English like a native speaker to get any sort of job or go to school or whatever it is. I should have put the Jeopardy music in here for these 30 seconds that it takes people. There
I
we
got
go.
you. Do, 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 do.
Right. Thanks. Dr. Graham Brown with What's a Native Speaker, right? What does it even mean? Brittany backing her up. There we go. What Lynn, I don't know if you go by Lynn or Lori, I'm sorry, is sort of getting at here. Don't millions of people work here in the US without speaking like quote unquote native speakers? Okay, Lynn, Lori, so both, okay. Is when we say this about our students, we are, well, let me back up. Since there are obviously many, many people who are successful without that being the case, then when you think about the students in front of you and this statement, you're basically saying that the only way that they can be quote unquote successful is this, right? It's honestly kind of narrowing these students' possibilities without giving them a chance. It depends on certain jobs, obviously, and obviously, for example, you don't want to become a translator if you don't have certain translation skills, which is not the same thing as being a native speaker. I'm just giving an example of a language job. But, these obstacles, right, that you are putting in your students' way without those obstacles necessarily being there, right? So people, to be clear, Carol, everybody has an accent, right? But accents that aren't American accents, and again, American isn't even one accent, right? It's a big country with 300-something million people. So, all right, Derek puts videos of non-native speakers, quote unquote. We always use it in quotes, right? Because it's like, sometimes I get frustrated with sort of academic stuff because like I don't want to use the native and non-native framing, but on the other hand, I'm not quite sure what other words to use. So you just end up using quotations, and then you end up writing an article where there's a quotation every 5 words and it just looks unreadable. And that's a problem with academic writing that I don't need to go into right now. But just for ease of discussion, that's what we use. Okay. And then there's, footnotes. Trust me. Yeah. It's just impossible to read academic stuff. You don't get me started. I think I've already gotten myself started. All right. So we're going to do one more, and then I'll give you some sort of general suggestions, some of which you've already mentioned, and then we can talk a little bit more openly about these things, and people can share maybe some experiences now that you see the sort of examples that are here. And remember, the qualification is that you or someone has said something about race or racism, and the response shuts it down without mentioning race or racism. Okay, because if they mention it, well, then it's just racist or something, right? This is within the world of racism, but it's a little bit different. Okay, and this is one of my favorite ones. I like this picture. You're so right. I think it's very important to respect all cultures. So I'm gonna tell you a story while you all start typing this out. When I first started writing about race and language, that was not even my intent as a scholar. I wasn't even planning to think about it. I was in a class. My doctoral program was not about language. It was about education in general. But we had to take research courses on different topics. So one was about disability, which is honestly how I got into the research and eventually got diagnosed. One was about literacy, and one was about language teaching, right? So when I come to the language teaching class, I'm like, I got this, because I got the master's and I know what I'm doing here. But there were still things I had not heard, right? And that's where I heard about racial linguistics and so forth. Now, some of that's timing. When I got my master's, those articles hadn't come out yet. But, we had these discussions. And so this was the first time I ever got a chance to do any sort of study, and I put together a very small survey. It's like a few questions, and I just wanted to know, do people teach about race and language in their classes? And I'm not necessarily saying that it was bad for someone to say, no, they don't. I just wanted to know. And one of the responses was, I added the "you're so right," but I asked if they teach race and language, and they said yes. And then the "please elaborate" was, I think it's very important to respect all cultures, which is not the same thing as race. So anyway, I think I've just given you enough time to respond. And some of you, Brittany, for example, may remember me sending out that survey 5 years ago. All right. So let's talk about race and culture, right? They are both very important. They overlap. They're not the same thing. And it's just much easier for people to talk about culture than to talk about race, because culture, although you can use it negatively, is generally a neutral to positive word. But if you start talking about race, people get uncomfortable. And part of the way that we diminish our students and narrow their identity is when we do our little, what do we call it? Holidays and heroes thing, right? Yeah, people do use culture as a euphemism for race, which is interesting, right? And then students, we say we want to respect their cultures, but all we do is boil their culture down to, Lunar New Year. Now I understand Chinese culture, right? Or, oh, my Mexican student brought in some tacos. I understand Mexican culture, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying people say that. Heroes and holidays, right? Who is a great person from your country? And it's like, so my point is, if this person and others were truly respectful of everybody's cultures, that's great. But the industry isn't actually respectful of everyone's culture. So it's both a discursive buffer for discussions of race, and also it's not even true that we as an industry respect other cultures, or even just in some extents, the cultures that are right in front of us in the cities and states that we're teaching in. All right, anybody else have a final suggestion before I move into my final suggestions, and then we talk and people can share from their own experiences and so forth? I'm going to wait a few seconds because it takes a moment to type things out.
It might be interesting to not really look at it. Where am I? Should I be here? Is that important? It might be interesting to not only look at it in the immediacy, like for that immediate moment, but to offer that person to discuss it in a later time. So it's not like we have to solve the whole world in these 30 seconds. But let's continue this. Let's talk about it a little bit later. I can offer some readings. We can have discussions. We can, talk in other ways. We can maybe learn a little bit about these other cultures. So everything doesn't have to be in that moment solve the world. Let's look at it more of a recursive perspective.
Right. Thanks, Derek.
Can I add to that? I totally agree with that. And I think for me, like I'm a really impatient person, but what I've been trying to get used to is sort of playing the long game. I mean, like you said, a lot of these conversations tend to happen at work, and these are people I see often. So I kind of try to like Derek said before about like, the generative thing, like continuing the conversation, like how can we continue this conversation? And maybe like you said, not necessarily solve it today, but come back to it and try and approach it in a productive way at a later time too.
Yeah, that's Helene just put an interesting point in there, and thanks, Alexis. Is that first of all, people don't even really know what they mean when they say culture a lot of the time, right? Because if you say, I respect Guatemalan culture, as Helene was pointing out, there's more than one culture in Guatemala. So when we do this holidays and heroes thing, we're mushing a whole country of usually millions of people into like one surface culture. As Joy put in here, it's like the iceberg metaphor. If we think about, culture as being what's the picture they put on the Lonely Planet book before you go to the country, right? Do people still buy Lonely Planet books? They do everything on their phones now. You know, that's just going to flatten people into something that may be somewhat accurate, but does not take into account power and hierarchies and so forth, as Christian is saying. Okay, so you all did great work. I'm going to give you some phrases you can always use, some of which you already say. Okay. I'm sorry. What did you mean by that? Right? You probably know what they mean by that, but I think you can hold it together long enough because I have no poker face, but I can hold it together long enough to say, I'm sorry. What did you mean by that? Because you're basically forcing them to explain. And honestly, if these people are truly meaning to be beneficial to the people they're talking about, they'll stop and they'll try to think about it. And you'll find out pretty fast if they've never thought about it and what it means for them not to have thought about it. Because if they just haven't thought about it and they're like, you know what, I need to think about that, we have succeeded. And if they say they never thought about it and you can tell that they don't think they have to think about it, then you'll know what you need to know, right? Another option, I'm not really sure I agree. Where did you read or hear that? Which is basically like citation needed, right? That's a slight disagreement, but you said I'm not really sure, which is a softer way to disagree with people, right? And then you're asking for evidence of whatever it is. For example, maybe it's the accent thing, or maybe you can't get a job if you're not a native speaker. You need to provide evidence for something like that, right? Because that is a pretty bold and incorrect claim. Another way is to say, that doesn't really feel right to me. Now, we're getting into feelings rather than facts, right? And then people can either pull back or they can change tacks, or they'll just know that if they say that sort of thing, people might not like how it feels. Some of you already said the fourth one, where it's like we're talking about testing and accents. Did you ever think about why, the tests only allow you to do this? Did you ever think about why your students might want to reduce their accents? Did you ever think about why? You get what I'm saying? And then like, this is like the strongest one, is like, I can't really support that, which is again, not yelling at somebody, but you're still putting your foot down just a little bit in a way that's going to make them pause. So I'm going to open it up for questions here. Let me actually do the other stuff, that stuff at the end, and then I'll come back and we'll have questions. And then at the very end, or no, I'll let you, Shauna do the promotions, and then we'll just talk until the 1 o'clock time. So first of all, I'm a member of the NICE TESOL Anti-Racist Action Special Interest Group. Join us for more of these strategies, discussions, readings, webinars. Next webinar is soon. That's the email address. Email us if you'd like to be part of our discussions. Alexis on here is also part of that discussion group. Okay, that's my information. I know this isn't over yet. It's just once we open it up, I want to put all the faces on the screen, so there's no point. That's my email address, is jpbgerald.com. I have a podcast where I sometimes talk about language and sometimes talk about whatever's in my head, because like I said, I have ADHD and I don't focus very well. That's my email address. Despite the fact that I graduated from Hunter, they never took it away from me, so I use that for all my academic stuff. If you want to argue with me, you're going to be in my next book, so don't do that. All right. Shauna, do you want to put a plug for NICE TESOL, and then we can have a discussion all together?
I would love to. Thank you. Thanks, Justin. I'm always so fascinated, with your ideas and your thoughts. And I love your podcast, by the way. So we'll give a little plug for that, right? Unstandardized what's the name of your podcast, Justin?
English.
Unstandardized English. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I love that as well. So thank you everyone for joining. If I don't know you, I'm Shauna Sweet. I'm coming to you live from Rochester, New York. I'm current president of NICE TESOL. Also want to give a shout out to our leaders who are on. So Christian Perticone is our Vice President of Outreach, who is doing a great job in organizing events like this with our SIGs. And Leslie Painter-Farrell is our SIG leader. So if you have an interest of getting involved and you have something that you're passionate about, reach out to any of those. We also have Christine Passarelli, our Advocacy Vice President. Big shout out to Christine. Nikki Bell, our Vice President of Conference Elect, is on. And like I said, we're just glad to see a lot of familiar faces. We would love to have you join as a member Currently, annual membership is only $40. And we also have a student membership discount, which I believe is currently free, and retiree membership is $25. So we'd love to see you folks join if you're not already a member and start getting involved, because I think some of the things that I've heard in this discussion in terms of being able to support one another with working through things, and even talking about things, I know it came up in the chat and what Justin said about assessments and exams, like, you know, things can be changed if we have a voice. And that's where I encourage you to reach out. I know our advocacy group is talking a lot about graduation requirements and regents exams on the high school front. But again, there's power in numbers. So I won't take up any more time, but I just want to say thank you all for being here. And before we end at 1, I'd love to take a group selfie for whoever is on. Unless you want to do that now, I'll leave it up to you, Justin.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that now. And then we're gonna so while this is happening, all of you think about this and think about perhaps experiences you've had that remind you of the things that I said. And then we'll talk about it. So let's do this picture and then we'll talk for the next 13 minutes.
Okay, group selfie for the nice TESOL world. And what I will do, turn your cameras on if you're interested. If you're not, you can keep your camera off. But we just want to give a shout out and be really proud of the representation that we have here today. So on the count of 3, say cheese. 1, 2, 3. Oh, hold on. 1 second. Sorry. I got to do it one more time. There we go. All right. Thank you, everyone. All right. We'll take it away with the discussion.
Okay, folks. So we can go whatever direction you want. You can type in the chat, but now that we're all just sort of sitting here and there's nothing to look at on the screen, you know, feel free to unmute or whatever, right? It might work better if you raise your hand just so that we have an organization. But if there's the 3 possible ways to go with this for something to say is 1, do you have any experiences that remind you of some of the things that were on the screen? If so, what was it like? What did you do? Maybe what do you wish you have done differently? Okay. And then the second one being, do you have any other guidance for people about how to push through these things? I said 3, there's 2. Those are the 2 choices. So past experiences and what it was like, and then any additional guidance that may have been generated during the discussion. And then I'll close it out at like 12:56 or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, I do. I get those kind of comments often, maybe like a few times a week, especially if I'm in hoodie mode. So when I'm in my suit and tie mode, it's different. But in hoodie mode, I get them a lot. Also, I traveled and I worked abroad in several countries, and it's very tough to, you know, try to talk about these kinds of issues, and in response, the conversation veered to someplace else. But I take much heart in what Helene Marshall said about kind of like centering what is important to the other person, and from that space being generative to what can be discussed. I find that is very effective. Just putting self to the side, creating spaces for other people, and then from that generating, and then trying to enter the conversation and contribute as possible.
Thanks, Derek. All right, Irina, I saw you unmuted yourself, so now you have to talk.
Hi, everyone. So I had one experience, like not very pleasant experience. However, I did my conclusions from this. And the phrases you shared with us is really might help us and me in particular. In the kindergarten where I used to work, I had a little girl, skin darker than mine, but she was like too much active, like hyperactive. And literally, I couldn't do anything about the girl. So I approached the parents and I said, like, how she behaves at home. Maybe you can talk to her, maybe because she's like too much active. And parents said, okay. And then the very next day, the director called me and said, "What did you say to parents?" I said, "Well, I said maybe we should collaborate together. They would talk to her at home. We would talk at home and here at school." And they say, "No, you said because she's Black and because she's hyperactive." I said, "I didn't say that. I didn't mean that." So yeah, what I understood, we must be too much careful with words here in the USA. So I came from the foreign country, from Ukraine, and I do have accent, I know. However, we need just to choose the correct words. We need to choose some approach and to be maximum gently. Still, I don't know how I supposed to approach parents here with what maybe I should tell, like you suggested, what do you think? How do you think about this? Maybe to start with this point of view, and the situation will go in totally different way. So really appreciate for these phrases. It will help me to manage the situation better now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing about the suggestions that I've been making here is that they work in every direction, right? Because part of the reason that these discursive buffers are a problem is that they're not doing this for us, right? So if I bring up something about race and someone disagrees and they ask me a question, well, then we can have a discussion about it. But if I bring up something about race and then they say one of the things that I said, they're kind of shutting it down. So the point is that, yes, it's just to open things up and have a discussion. Nicole has her hand raised. Sorry, we go to the next person. Nicole.
I was just going to say that one thing that I found that, we've had these conversations with friends about the ability to make people feel comfortable to engage in these conversations. And one of my friends is a young Black woman, and she mentioned to me one day that it's not her responsibility to make everyone feel comfortable. And so she's tired, and she's rightfully so, right? She's rightfully tired. So it's one of those like catch-22s where you're like stuck in the middle, because yes, we need to make people feel comfortable, but at what point do we, I don't know, put that responsibility on someone else? And so I don't know if that, I think I'm just thinking out loud in terms of like, what are your thoughts on that?
That's why I said give everybody one chance.
I like that. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I learned that not only just from experience, but because not too long after I put out that survey 5 years ago, I went to a conference and I posted something from like a picture from one of the presentations, right? And someone got in, I posted on Instagram, and someone got in my DMs to say something that was not like, it was a discursive buffer type thing. Like nobody said anything about race, right? I didn't even say anything about race. But they were just really mad. Actually, it wasn't even my DMs, it was a public comment. And I was just sort of shaken because it was the first time. I'm like, I didn't even say anything about racism. Why are you so mad? And then I happened to walk out of whatever presentation I was in, and I saw somebody who I knew from their work on racism, and I said, can I ask you a question about this? And she said, give everybody one chance because you'll find out pretty quickly if they're worth continuing to work with, right? And I do understand being tired. I'm tired too. Part of it is that as a teacher, I do feel a little bit of a responsibility as an educator because I have more skills than just a regular person. I don't mean more than you all. We're all mostly in education space, right? But like, because we are trained in teaching, then I do think we owe it to give everybody, depending on the limits, right? If someone's just yelling at you, that's one thing. But if for something like this, when they try to shut it down, I give them one chance, right? Whether that's asking a question or expressing confusion or whatever. And then it's really easy to know, depending on how they respond, if it's going to be a productive conversation, right? And to be clear, they might not respond because they're taken aback, but that's not the same as insisting that what they said was right. Because just like it might be hard for us to come up with a quick response, they may never have had the question asked to them, and they may not be able to come up with a quick response. to me, one of my best friends now is somebody who did something that was, you know, a pretty small microaggression. And I want to be clear, microaggression means interpersonal, not small. People get that wrong all the time. But anyway, but this microaggression was small because I was giving a webinar and she assumed I was one of the students, right? And then she was like, oh no, and she emailed me and now we're really good friends. She made a mistake, right? You know, if I could have shut her down because I just like, I don't have time for this, but I was like, I'll give you a chance. Oh no, more accurately, I made her buy me lunch. And then now we're friends. So I was like, well, you can buy me lunch if you want to. So, you know, sometimes you get free food out of it too. Anybody else want to chime in? Probably got time for one more person. Ideally, someone who hasn't spoken before. I don't want to shut everybody else down, but just because in case there's anyone who hasn't been. All right, May, thank you.
Yeah, sorry for my camera not being on. But based on, you know, following what Nicole had mentioned and then the experience you just shared, I had I don't know, I guess a slightly shameful one from when I started teaching. And a student came in, saw me at like the front desk and was like, "Oh, so you're the teacher." And she was a bit older and I actually made the way out for her, like, "Oh, because I look so young, right?" But you know, there was that undercurrent that I just kind of evaded for her. And it was along the lines of like, I didn't want to make a student then uncomfortable on the first day of class.
Yeah, you also have to think about the context of the conversation, right? If it's your
Yeah.
direct colleague, is it your boss? Is it your employee, right? Is it your student? So that's why I don't like to come in here. That's why I don't like to lecture, but so much because I don't know what the context is, right? Every context is going to be a little bit different. That's why I try to give pretty broadly applicable advice. See, and then Derek says things like that. I've had, well, not that, but I've had people just be shocked that I would be their teacher. Not so much in New York, but when I was teaching in other countries, right? And other countries, plural, like one other country, right? And you know, just confused. But I was lucky. I was at a high school, and the high school kids thought I was cool because they liked sports, which is another thing. But they just thought I was like a basketball player or something, which is like I'm not. I'm like 5'5". So you know, there's that. All right. I don't think we necessarily have enough time to answer a full question here. My son is apparently bouncing off the walls in my apartment, so I have to go tend to that because he didn't get to run around that much this morning because I had to come back here. So now I got to go soak up that energy. But thank you all for being here this morning / afternoon. That's happened to me too, Derek. And I hope that this was useful to all of you in some way. The conversation, you know, I wanted this to be something that, as people have said, regenerative. And so that when you are in these situations, you can at least call back on some of what was said here. All right. You all have a good afternoon then.
Thank you so much, Justin. This was an awesome way to kick the year off. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Justin. We checking out your Instagram stories. You're very active there. We see you.
Thank you, Justin.
I hope to hear from you again. Thanks, Christian and Leslie, for organizing.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Justin.
Leslie, do you have a second to stay around? We could just talk over some stuff.
You can stop the recording.
Oh, yeah.